Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Facts and Fallacies, episode 225. I'm your host, as always, Cameron English, joined again by Dr. Liza Dunn. Liza, what's going on? How are you?
Not much. Happy 4th of July. That's coming up soon.
Yes. If you're in the United States, celebrate barbecues, beer, long weekend. It's going to be great. I'm glad I'm not in France.
Me too.
Yeah. Looks pretty perilous for some people in Paris. I hope that all resolves quickly. And
it's pretty lively.
Yeah, no one else gets hurt because we don't like that. Pain is bad. Violence is bad.
Yes, it is bad.
But in any case, our simple moral lessons aside, let's talk about some science. We've got 3 stories as always, and I'm excited. These are, sometimes we say the news is just bad and there's nothing we can do about that, but we've got some great stuff today. So first up, U.S. agriculture, a toxic soup of factory farming, corporate greed, and gene-altered crops. We're going to debunk 10 myths, including everything I just read. Next up, a new malaria vaccine could save thousands of lives in Africa. Here's everything you need to know about it. And finally, older polio vaccines can mutate into a dangerous version of the disease. A new super-engineered vaccine is much safer. Really cool stuff. The last 2 stories, especially there, Liza. This first one is, it's an encouraging story. It's not talking about encouraging things, though. And it's well-worn territory for this show, except for a couple of items we'll talk about. But this is a story by Michelle Miller at Ag Daily. She goes by the Farm Babe, I think, is one of her nicknames.
Awesome. And you should totally follow her on Twitter.
She's great. Kevin and I joke sometimes about the pantheon of babes in the food debate because there's so many. There's the Sci Babe, the Food Babe, which is the bad babe. And then there's
right.
And there's Michelle. I think there's a handful of others. But in any case, she's a great writer. She has a background in agriculture. Unlike a lot of the people who feel free to pontificate about farming, she actually knows what she's talking about. And here she's going through the top 10 myths about food and agriculture. Some of them I don't, unless you want to touch on them, I don't even think we need to cover it because it's things like GMOs are dangerous, that sort of thing. But there's a few that I wanted to go through that aren't as well worn. But give me your thoughts on this. What stuck out to you that she's talking about here?
Well, I think once again, a lot of people think that, organic farming doesn't use any pesticides at all. And there's nothing wrong with organic farming. It's fed people for 10,000 years, but it does use pesticides. And sometimes it has to use pesticides at higher doses or or more frequently than you do with synthetic pesticides. So synthetic pesticides are often much more environmentally friendly, have a better toxicity profile in terms of lower toxicity, and you don't have to quite use them as much. And so they are all of them, the ones used in organic farming and the ones used in conventional farming and the ones used for GMOs are all tested and regulated and really, really monitored to make sure that they aren't causing untoward human health effects, animal health effects, and off-target environmental effects.
Yeah, it's a really important point. And we don't think about it with other technologies, rotary phones were great for the time, right? I think at least when I was a little kid, that was still a thing. I don't think, kids younger than me, or I guess anyone younger than me would maybe understand that. But you don't see people going around and saying, my grandma's rotary phone is great. And Big Phone is trying to hook you on their iPhones and their Galaxies. And,
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's just so obvious. It's just so like the benefits and other, other parts of the economy or other technologies. There's really no question, at least, when it comes to the kind of issues we talk about with food. So that's a really good point. It's not bad, but we have something better now. So let's embrace that.
And we forget that pesticides are really critical for public health, right? And you use them at home in higher doses than you're ever. And once again, that's regulated too. You have to have a licensed pesticide applicator often if you've got an issue at your home, right? I don't know if you remember the big, huge bed bug outbreak in New York City that spread all the way across the country and things like that. bed bugs and lice and fleas were all very common back in the Middle Ages and all the way through the 1800s. And we can control those. And we take that for granted now. But those are going to be in a little bit higher doses than you'd ever get in trace amounts on your food. So they're really, really important. Really, really important.
Another myth she takes on here, and I think this is just me speculating, pontificating, if you will, but she takes on this idea that factory farming is this evil, abhorrent practice. And I think this might be the greatest lie there is about agriculture, is that mass scale food production, particularly animal foods, like producing these on a mass scale is bad for animals or bad for humans. This is just pure nonsense. If you look at the available evidence, if you talk to people that do this for a living. And one of the points that Michelle's made on a different occasion as well is that taking care of your animals, because that's when what they're talking about with factory farms is, they're all these poor little chickens, they're stuffed in here, and these poor cows are beaten by their owners and all this nonsense, because you have groups like PETA that will sneak onto private property and they will film a handful of bad actors. There are people over time that have done very cruel things to animals, but they put out these videos and then they say, look, this is how your food's produced. And that's not true. And one of the things Michelle has said in response to that is, it's a bad business model to harm your animals, because if they are physically or even, psychologically uncomfortable, they are not as productive. And if you're in the business of selling milk and meat and eggs, you want to sell as much of those goods as you can. And so you take care of your animals as a result.
That's right. That's right. And do you know who coined the term factory farm?
I don't.
RFK Jr.
Get out of town. Did he really?
That's what I've heard. Yes, wow. That's what I've heard. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's kind of very interesting. Yes, it's very interesting. So, and that's promoted this, vision, this visual of farms being, animals sort of crammed into terrible spaces and, dirty environments and things like that. But it's not like that at all. And you are absolutely right. People want to have they treat their animals well. They want to have the most productive animals possible. So one of the kind of myths around factory farms are that like cage-free birds do so much better. But another term comes from that, and that is henpecked. And henpecked is actually a situation where aggressive birds that are kind of not kind of comfy and all snuggled up next to each other, but out on, free range birds will go after each other and peck each other literally to death. So that's where that term comes from. And it comes from the old practice of raising chickens sort of on the loose and in the wild. So it's much more healthy for chickens not to be running around on their own when you've got a large operation. And large operations are actually much more efficient and more friendly to animals. You want the most efficient. We've got fewer dairy cattle now, making more milk now than ever before in the history of mankind, because they've really figured out how to scale milk production in the most beneficial way for both cattle and people. So those are just two kind of common misconceptions that people have about factory farms and animal farming. Another misconception that people have are that the people moving, and this is kind of in the opposite direction. People there's a lobby against meat and milk and eggs, right? And people are lobbying to go to a more plant-based diet. Well, the most efficient plant-based diet is we can't eat grass or silage or things like that. So the cattle and ruminants and pigs can, eat that stuff that we can't eat normally, and they can concentrate that up into high quality protein. And it's much more high quality protein than you can get from just plants alone or the leftovers of plants alone, which they're very important for managing. So we don't have all this bulk refuse, right, in there. So people have this notion that a plant-based diet is going to be so much better for the environment. Also, you'd have to use every inch of land to get that kind of protein, and a lot of times you don't have the productive kind of land that animals can actually graze on and turn into protein, that you can't use that land to grow crops or vegetables or fruits and things like that. So takes kind of low quality grass or whatever that we can't eat and can convert it into a food source. And meat, milk, and eggs are critical for brain development in kids. And so often you see kids with low protein diets, they can get something called protein calorie malnutrition, which is a really severe form of malnutrition, but it stunts their growth. And growth stunting, if they don't get enough protein in their diet, is actually a reflection of also brain growth. And so you can see growth stunting, and then you wind up with actual IQ impacts because there's not enough protein in their diet. So this is really critical for nutrition. It's really critical for waste management because you've got silage and all sorts of things left over. And the last thing is that some people think that, companies are only interested in these plant-based diets so they can grow their crops. And sell to people who want to make, corn or soy or whatever, and that can go directly into the human diet. Well, they forget that companies are also selling to farmers who are livestock farmers. And so much of that food source is actually going to animal agriculture too. So it would not be in a company's interest to just completely do a plant-based diet, right? Because a huge proportion of what we sell go to people who are going to go feed their animals with it. So those are a lot of myths around livestock and animal ag.
There is so much nonsense in this field. And what's interesting to me is that there's a lot of very, very well-educated people with a lot of influence who buy into this stuff. It's just nonsense. And to give you one example, there was a massive study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017. And they tried to model what it would be like to get the world off of animal products, going to a full plant-based diet. And the reduction in greenhouse gases was something like 2.6 percentage points. It's insignificant. And part of it is what you were talking about, which is, the animals graze land that we can't grow on, and they eat a bunch of plant matter that we can't eat, and that has no other use. So all of that goes away, those benefits, plus all the products you get from animals.
And they fertilize the land too.
Yes, that's right.
And increase soil health.
Right. So not only do you lose all that, but you have to dump a bunch more inputs into growing more grains and more all this stuff that humans have to eat now. And so that has a climate impact as well. And one other thing that Michelle says about this before we move on is, farms are really good at using their resources sparingly. She talks about water. She talks about recycling methane, which we've mentioned earlier on the show. She talks about the fact that methane and CO2 are very different in terms of their climate impact. One lasts for a long time. Methane lasts like 10 to 12 years before it's broken down and recycled back into CO2 that animals eat and plants. So there's just so many things here, and we're only skimming the surface, but there's so many things people need to be aware of that they're not. And yet they're still going to tell me that I need to feed my son bugs. And I'm not interested in that.
No, that's not happening. That there's a study, we could talk about this maybe sometime. There are studies that demonstrate that farmed bugs carry pathogens that can be problematic for people, one. And we know that because, bugs carry bacteria and all sorts of stuff. They've got a microbiome that they like to share with people and make people sick. And then there are also the parasites like worms that they carry. And so they also are allergenic too. So it's people with seafood allergies or shellfish allergies can have cross-reactivity with insect proteins. So it's really important to not sort of do a pie in the sky kind of thing about how important real high quality protein is for people's diets.
Yeah. And another thing related to that drives me nuts is you will point all this out and they will say, well, that's just your Western bias. It just has an ick factor and you can get over that. And what cracks me up is these are the same people that tell me and everyone else in science and agriculture that you can't give new technologies to people on the other side of the world because that's colonialism and they have a food culture that you have to respect. So which is it? Does everyone get their own culture? Which is okay, right? It's okay to say, I like to eat this and not that because my family bonds over a meal of this. And it's important for a variety of activities and behaviors and, our identity as a society. And I think that drives me nuts that that's so easily dismissed because they're like, look, just eat mealworms. It's fine. We'll put it in a popsicle for you.
Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, then they also have to respect, other cultures that have primarily meat and milk diets, right?
Right.
So Maasai, for example, they really live off of milk and blood from cattle. They're cattle herders. And so different cultures have different practices, and it's important to respect those practices. But the global South deserves the same food security that we have in order to get them out of, food insecurity and be good for protect their children and things like that. They deserve to have access to the same technology that we have access to.
Sure. It's absolutely true. And we know how to do it. It's not easy and it takes time, but we know how to grow economies and we know how to introduce these technologies and make people's lives better. So we need to do it. That leads to the final thing I want to mention briefly. She says that there's the myth out there that modern farming only benefits big companies. This is dumb, and I'm sure you have lots to say here, but the only point I'll make is that big companies become big companies because they make things that people want to buy, right? In this case, they produce seeds and chemicals and other inputs that farmers want to use, and that makes the farmers more productive, which pushes down food prices for you and for me, and it gives us a wider variety. So it doesn't mean that all big companies are great and they never make any mistakes. That's not what I'm saying. But as a general rule, companies get big because they do things well and they please their customers.
That's true. And the other reason why companies get big and stay bigger is because often there are so many regulations around products that companies make that if you're a startup or you're an innovator, you can't actually finance what it takes to get through the regulatory process. So when you have regulations like regulations about GMOs, which are so well studied and so well understood, if you're a startup company that has a really great idea for of how to genetically modify a plant, like, for example, Lena Tripathi, who is a brilliant scientist who's from Africa, who has genetically modified a banana to be resistant to banana wilt. She's had a difficult time getting that on the market because the regulatory hurdles are so high. But that's a staple crop in Uganda and is really important for subsistence farmers. So subsistence farmers are unable to get access to the same technologies that we've got access to that could very well benefit them because of the regulatory apparatus around that. Now, I'm not saying regulations are bad. I think we need regulations, but over-regulating because of the precautionary principle or scaring people into over-regulating really, doesn't help small companies. So if we want small companies to flourish, we need to think about that as one of the issues that we need to have sensible regulation.
That's right. Yeah, we could talk about that for hours. And it's a sad irony that the people who complain about big companies and corporate farming, they push the rules that incentivize big companies to maintain a stranglehold on the market. Okay, let's move on though. Let's talk about this new malaria vaccine. This is super cool. I was really happy to read this story because sometimes there's not great things that we get to talk about. So this is by a writer named Priya Joy, and she's writing for an organization called Vaccines Work. So you know where they stand on vaccines. Yeah. So she starts by pointing out Ghana in Africa. It looks like they're going to be the first country to approve this new vaccine. It's called R21. It's a malaria vaccine. You can talk more about the technical side of how it works. Mm-hmm. But this is significant because it's only the second vaccine for malaria that's been developed. There's one other one, and it's had an impact, like it's reduced malaria cases by 30%, where it's been
hospitalization by 30%.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's a big deal, especially if you live in a place that doesn't have the greatest healthcare. The fact that you don't have to go to a hospital if there is one where you live. is a big deal. Now, this became an important project again because we started to, I don't want to say lose the fight, but we started to lose some ground against malaria starting in 2015. So I believe they said from 2000 to 2015, thanks to anti-malarial drugs, thanks to pesticides, all the things we've talked about in the last few weeks, we got really good at controlling malaria. But after 2015, we started to lose a little bit of ground, and then COVID hit, and the world's focus went to this new virus, right? So there's fewer resources, there's fewer attention dedicated to malaria, and it starts to make a resurgence. And so this created the incentive to develop this vaccine. So that's just a quick starting point, so everyone's kind of aware of what we're talking about. Can you talk more about the vaccine, like how it works and why it's encouraging?
Yeah, we can talk about a couple of different things. I just want to throw a few stats out there because most people aren't really, in the West, used to learning about malaria. So, it seems like it's off in a far away place, and so they don't really pay attention to it. But about 250 million people get infected a year, and there are over maybe 650,000, 700,000 deaths every year from malaria. So that's like a pandemic level, right? That's a huge outbreak. And this is annually. This is like having a worldwide problem annually. And so the malaria vaccine that was on the market originally was called Mosquirix. And it takes a lot of doses, and it doesn't seem like when you hear it, it reduces hospitalization by 30%. Go, oh my gosh, is that really worth doing a lot of doses over? Well, if you think about that many people being infected, that was actually reducing hospitalization for a significant amount of people. And that's really, really kind of important. Now, this new vaccine, though, is really interesting because it reduces, it has a 77% efficacy. It is really a game changer for malaria. Malaria control all the way up to 2015 was getting so good that they were almost thinking that the combination of this earlier vaccine plus the control measures would be getting close to possibly eradicating it. This was on the table for that. But this is really, really a neat vaccine. So what it does is the way the malaria parasite works is mosquitoes carry it in their saliva. And it's the Anopheles mosquito that carries it in its saliva. And when it bites for a blood meal, it injects a baby version of Plasmodium, which is the parasite that you're infected with, right? And that gets into your bloodstream. It's called the sporocyte. Think of it as a spore. It gets injected into your bloodstream and it floats in and then goes and it gets into liver cells. And there it winds up replicating in liver cells. And when it replicates in liver cells, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until the liver cells start bursting. And then you spill merozytes out, and they hide themselves from the immune system by actually coating themselves in liver cell membranes. So they sneak out of the liver, and they cause hepatic injury when they're rupturing those cells. But then they go back into the bloodstream and infect the red blood cells. And what they do, the Plasmodium falciparum, there are four major different types of malaria, and falciparum is the worst kind. Falciparum actually makes the red blood cells express proteins on their surfaces, and they get sticky. And they wind up sticking in the microcirculation and causing all sorts of little microclots that can be really, really problematic. And they can also cross the blood-brain barrier and cause a cerebral malaria. So you wind up with sticky red blood cells that don't carry oxygen very well and microclots and really, really bad disease in some people. And once again, since it's in the red blood cell, your immune system misses it. And this is why the malaria is very hard to develop a vaccine to, because the immune system doesn't see the initial merozytes that are covered in a coat of the cell membranes of the liver, and it doesn't see them in the coat of the red blood cells. So it's hard for the immune system to recognize it. So the key is to try to figure out how to get the immune system to recognize it. And this new vaccine, it winds up it shares a protein. With that is in the sporocyte, the very, very early, the baby malaria parasite being initially injected in the bloodstream. There's a protein that expresses that's unique to the sporocyte. And before it gets into the, before it has its disguise on, its invisibility cloak of cell membranes on. And they've used that protein to train the immune system to recognize it early in infection so it can't get to the liver. Does that make sense? Malaria is a kind of complicated thing to explain, but yeah. So they've got it at a very, very early stage. The immune system is trained to recognize it, and it prevents it from getting into the liver in the first place and having this replication phase. So it's a fascinating way to deal with it.
It's a really clever approach too, and I think it sounds like what you're saying is you get it early before it does all this nasty stuff that can really wreak havoc, which is cool. But then one other thing I was hoping you would explain, and I think it speaks to another concern people have about vaccines, is that it's paired with a portion of the hepatitis B virus in this vaccine. And I think the idea is when you get the vaccine, your immune system sees that part of the virus and it goes, we got a problem here, but it recognizes the parasite as well.
Right. So it amplifies the reaction to that pre-liver infection stage, right? That's exactly right.
Okay.
So it's
yeah, that's
and it's with an adjuvant called matrix M, which is another kind of naturally occurring plant. It's a saponin, which makes the immune system react really, really well too. So there are all sorts of components to this vaccine that are really interesting. So you get it early on because you're in the sporocyte phase. Plus, you've got the hepatitis B part that's neutralized, right? It's a protein that's expressed by hepatitis B that you can train your immune system to recognize earlier. So it broadens the immune response. So you don't just need one or two. Remember, the mosquito is tiny, and it's just injecting this little tiny sporocyte in there. And then you wind up amplifying the immune system by having the saponin plant-based adjuvant that makes it even more reactive.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because it always illustrates that, the dose makes the poison kind of a concept. And this is with a lot of vaccines. I think that's why ethyl mercury was in the MMR vaccine too, right? It was an adjuvant to boost the immune response.
It was actually a preservative.
Okay, that's right.
Preservative, yep. And it was bacterial static. So it wound up, when you've got vaccines that are on a shelf, and we'll talk about this a little bit with the oral polio vaccine a little bit.
Okay.
But when you get vaccines in a shelf, you don't want bacteria growing in them, especially if they're in solution, because you don't want to be injecting bacteria. So that's what thimerosal was supposed to do, is to boost bacteriostatics to prevent growth. Yeah.
Okay, I get them mixed up. I get preservatives and adjuvants mixed up sometimes. But in other words, that's a very common approach to boost the reaction to the vaccine and make it more effective, which is so cool, because people go, well, that's a dangerous chemical you're putting in there. And I've heard several experts say, yeah, of course. And here's why in tiny quantities, it serves a very important purpose.
Yes.
Okay. So speaking of polio vaccines, as you just mentioned, there is Go ahead.
Yeah. There are, in the past year, I think, New York Times just came out, USC's first case of local malaria transmission in 2 decades, June 27th, 2023, 5 people, 4 in Florida and 1 in Texas. So with climate change and global warming, you are seeing mosquitoes that can carry malaria. And so it may not be, malaria was eradicated in the United States and in Europe using DDT and swamp draining, right? But it was here. It was endemic to the United States. And so what we're seeing a resurgence, and 5 people getting it in Florida and Texas. So you may see, Anopheles mosquitoes making a comeback, and we need to really think carefully about this.
Coming to a summer near you if we're not careful. Yeah, it's a big deal. Okay. So on to the polio vaccine. This is a story originally by James Gallagher in BBC. And he's talking about some of these old, or at least one of the older polio vaccines that I think this surprises some people, is that the vaccine itself because it's just an attenuated or weakened polio virus, can mutate in your body and actually turn into a virus that can make you sick and you can spread it.
And that's the old oral polio vaccine. Yep.
Yeah. I think it was Albert Sabin's vaccine. Is that the one?
Yes, it was Sabin's vaccine. Salk's vaccine is an injected vaccine, and that didn't have that problem because that was not a live attenuated virus. That was a dead virus.
Okay. And I think it's that one or one of its descendants that we use here in the U.S. Right?
We use Salk. Yeah. Yep. Now, the problem with those vaccines, the reason why they moved to oral vaccines was, once again, if you have an injection, it's hard. It needs multiple injections, right? So you get three, I think it's 3 injections on your vaccine schedule before you're completely immune. So that's a hard thing to manage when you are trying to make large quantities and scale it up for large populations. And so the oral polio vaccine was much easier to manage and administer to, huge parts of the population. So that's why people started with Sabin. Now, polio was eradicated in the United States, and then people stopped using the oral polio vaccine because the very few cases of polio that were occurring were because of the virus was able to the live virus was able to mutate back into a pathogenic form. And so that could cause some paralysis. So people just decided to use the shots.
Gotcha. And again, I think this is another example of something we don't think about in the West, but this was a big problem in the United States in the 1950s. And Paul Offit, vaccine expert at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, he points out in one of his books that behind the atomic bomb, polio was the most feared health hazard in the United States. So this was huge, right? These vaccines were enormously important. And the fact that we've almost eradicated this around the world is huge. So, but the way that, and again, you can probably explain how this works better, but I think the basic idea is you genetically engineer the vaccine virus so it's harder for it to mutate. And then
that's exactly.
Okay, so talk about that, if you will.
So what they did was, once again, there are pockets of polio. We almost eradicated polio. It was almost the second thing after the smallpox that was eradicated. But there were pockets of polio in Afghanistan and in hard to reach places in Pakistan that actually kept on sort of bubbling up. And so what you would do is you'd give the oral polio vaccine to it. The oral polio vaccine was good enough to almost eradicate it around the world, okay? And so then you'd have these mutations that would make it transmissible to a small group of people. And that was where some of these pockets of resistant, or not resistant, but pockets of re-emerging polio could come from. And in fact, in New York, there was just recently a case of a person who had not been immunized, who had traveled and was and then wound up with poliomyelitis, paralyzed. Now, I don't think he was totally paralyzed, but had some nerve damage because of having that's probably likely a mutated vaccine that he was exposed to. And they found some samples of that in the wastewater. So the thought was that he was exposed to somebody who'd had the vaccine. Now, they have been able to make these vaccines less. The World Health Organization and Nature have just created a stable vaccine that's probably able to help eradicate, maybe make us achieve this eradication by genetically modifying the virus so it's not going to mutate. So it's very, very exciting. And it's that the polio, the 2 viruses, type 3 and 2, have been completely eradicated. So the ones that's wild type, that's not 100% eradicated, is the type 1 type. And it's interesting because this is a fecal oral transmission. You can get a little bit of droplet transmission as well, but people carry it in their gut and it's transmitted. The virus gets into the cells of the gut, and it's an RNA virus. So it winds up hijacking the machinery in the cell, the ribosomes in the cell, to make itself, right? So it gets into the cell, it uses the ribosome to make the viral proteins, and then the cell of the gut, the cells that line the gut, rupture, and you get some of that going into the feces, and then some of that going into the lymphatics, where it can replicate in the lymph nodes, and then get into the spinal cord. Myelitis means spinal cord, so that's where that comes from. But they've genetically stabilized the oral vaccine so it won't mutate. So it's really, really critical for getting rid of these pockets, and we can maybe see this being eradicated 100%.
That's so encouraging. And I'm glad it's happening with polio, because it's one of the few vaccine preventable illnesses that there's actually been some problem with vaccination in the past. Like if you go way back in time to like smallpox inoculation, it was pretty crude and there were risks there too. But like if people aren't familiar with the Cutter incident in 1955, this was, I think it was Salk's vaccine. It was improperly manufactured at this lab in California. And something like 40,000 kids got polio from the vaccine. I think 2 of them died, which is tragic, And 200,
terrible.
Yeah, 200 of them were paralyzed to one degree or another. And of course, the anti-vaccine movement has not shut up about this since it happened, right? This is one of their go-to. It's one of their go-to examples. And with this, they can actually point to one vaccine and say, the vaccine mutates, and right. So the fact that this seems to be shutting this down, it's great for the people who are not going to get polio. That's the most important aspect of this. But it's also going to cut off a route of attack for our fringier friends, which I'm really excited about, because they do a lot of damage by, telling, especially people in the developing world, don't get vaccines.
That's exactly right. And once again, there's a benefit to the oral vaccine in that it's more stable. You can have it in, hot environments and things like that. It's not as delicate as a giving a shot. It's much easier to manage and administer.
That's really cool. Well, that I think is a great way to end our show. Is there's new vaccines coming online that are going to save people's lives and save them a lot of misery and suffering. That's awesome. That's exactly right.
Very exciting.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there then, everybody. Thank you as always for listening or watching. Love having you join us every week. We'll be back next time for 226. Man, I can't believe we're flying along here. We got hecka episodes under our belts. Hecka. I don't know if people say hecka anymore. Probably not. Okay, but follow us on Twitter. In the meantime, it's at Dr. Liza MD, at CamJ English, at Genetic Literacy for the Genetic Literacy Project. Follow them. They get all the content that we talk about, and they put the show on for us, which is great. So with that, we'll see you next time.
Have a good week and happy 4th of July.